A Change of Art, Constantine the Great by Stephen Rodriguez. I'm going to talk to you about art during the time of Constantine the Great, who's considered one of the greatest rulers of Rome, which he led during the 4th century AD. We are going to look at the events going on leading up to his time of rule, and what impact these changes had on Rome after he died, as well as how these events changed the art and architecture of the civilization, which led to the Byzantine era. To start, we need to go back to the 4th century BC, a time when Alexander the Great was in power and had taken over a good portion of Europe and had toppled the great Persian Empire. This was a big deal, not only because he had defeated one of the biggest, baddest empires in history, but because this enabled the people of Greece to freely trade and mingle amongst the Eastern and Southwest Asian civilizations, who are now under Alexander the Great or Greece's rule. This new open network of trade allowed the Greek culture to change somewhat here and there because of the influences brought in by the customs of each new area. When Alexander the Great had died, his established kingdom was able to develop into both artistically and architecturally, bringing about what is called the Hellenistic period. Some of the characteristics of Hellenic architecture are bigger, more open buildings. Not only temples, but public facilities like outdoor auditoriums or theaters, parks, and places of worship. One of the best places to look at this style of architecture is at the Acropolis, where the Parthenon is located. Here we can see the design cues that have been discussed in class. The sculpting style of the time was at a very well-developed stage and brought about what I like to call realistic exaggeration. Realistic exaggeration is when the artist exaggerates features of the sculpture, i.e., muscles on the layout column, group statue, but it keeps it real enough to make the viewer think they can attain that type of definition with their body, even though it is not possible. The artists during this period also want to show feelings or expressions through the statues, so the viewer can almost feel the suffering as they look at the sculptures. Sculptures were more revealing and about the physical body, which was meant to inspire. Some characteristics of Hellenistic paintings are about humans, violence, and stories. Stone and the lack of color define not only the paintings, but Hellenistic art as a whole. Not many works have survived from this period. 100 BC to the birth of Christ. During the first half of this time period, Rome would be plagued with civil war and the big decision of agreeing upon a ruler. Eventually, Octavianus Augustus would become ruler and bring about peace and stability to the land. Coincidentally, this happens to be around the time when Rome is celebrating its 750th birthday. In honor of Rome's longevity as a powerful country, Octavianus would throw a jubilee to celebrate, a jubilee in which the people were to register at a census. There are two kinds of Roman census, a census for taxing and a census for loyal oath. This tax is what is responsible for bringing Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, where they would have baby Jesus. This little baby went on to create a religious movement and show the world that he is a god. The Roman emperors at the time, and up until Constantine, did not like this new guy, or religion, because it essentially failed to see them as gods. Rome persecuted Jesus, as well as his followers. After he died, this new sect of Jew, now called Christianity, began to grow in the shadows. For the next 3 centuries, these Christians would have a tough time being the minority, having to sneak around to practice their religion. At the beginning of the 4th century, there was a great prosecution of the Christians from a fearful Caesar. This ended after a couple of years because the ruler died. After this, we see Constantine come into power in 306 AD. The momentous event for Constantine and the Christians came just 6 years later in the Battle at Milvian Bridge. In 312, he marched on Rome to unseat one of his rivals, Maxentius. Before the campaign, Constantine had prayed for divine aid. On the eve of battle, with odds heavily against him, the emperor and his men saw a shining cross of light with the sun behind it, an image of the Greek letter Chi combined with Rho, the first letters of Christ's name, and heard a voice saying, "By this conquer." Amazed by this marvelous sight, he had this device, the Christogram, painted on his soldiers' shields and on his banner instead of the Roman eagle into battle. They routed Maxentius, who drowned in the Tiber. Somewhat quickly, we begin to see the Roman pagan gods of the past being replaced by this one new god. By the time he died, Constantine would have converted close to 90% of Rome into Christians. The architecture of the time of Constantine evolved from large spatial temples to church buildings with murals and such painted on the inside. They also began using precious metals and materials on the buildings to make it shine or look pleasing. St. John's Lateran gives us a good look at the change in buildings. The outside still has Hellenistic influences all around. We can also take a look at Old St. Petersburg for the same reasons. The reliefs on the buildings were now less about detail and realism and more about propaganda and advertising the ruler who made the building. A perfect example of this anti-attention to detail would be Constantine's Arch, the largest arch ever built by Rome. Not only did they use reliefs from previous works, they also had some of the heads removed and replaced them with Constantine's head. As you can see from a close-up of the arch, the detail seems to have taken a step back when comparing it to the Hellenistic period reliefs. They also began using the Chi symbol on architectural work as well as other Christian symbols, at first combining them with pagan symbolism and slowly fading it out over time so that only Christian symbols stood. The sculpting in Rome by this time had faded. Sculptures now were usually only erected for leaders, such as the colossal marble statue of Constantine. Not only were sculptures less in quantity, but the sculptures that were created had taken a step back as well, similar to the architectural reliefs, and become more disproportionate and blocky. The focus instead turned to sarcophagi, where they would create elaborate reliefs on the outside of sarcophagus. These reliefs would usually be filled with many Christian stories and or symbols depending on what your faith was. Paintings during this time period featured the same style as before, but moved into churches, where mosaics and frescoes could now be created as part of the entire piece that is the church building. Not many paintings of this time have survived, especially the early Christian art. Constantine moved the center of Rome from Western Rome to Eastern Rome, in a city he called New Rome, which was renamed by the people Constantinople. This is where Rome would carry on after Constantine passed away. From here, the Christian faith exploded and would create a new period called the Byzantine era, where the Christian faith would dominate all forms of art, with no other outside faith really competing with it. This era carried forth the seed that Constantine had planted and become more like what he had envisioned. A population that is mainly Christian, and a flourishing city that lasted quite a long time, massive church buildings, and beautiful Christian art. Now, Christianity is one of the biggest religions on earth. Thank you, Constantine.